Hi, I'm Ryan, and how important is the separation of powers? In this video, we'll answer that question through first, defining the separation of powers and identifying the constituent components that comprise it, second, through tracking the development of the separation of powers in the American context and breaking down what this concept looks like in the Constitution, and finally, through evaluating the historical and current challenges to the separation of powers in the United States. Let's dive in. The separation of powers is a fundamental principle of American governance, aimed at preventing the consolidation of power in a single person or entity. Its key goal is to diffuse and divide authority. But what does that look like? In broad strokes, let's frame it this way. We have four main pillars that support this larger concept of the separation of powers. First, we have the division of authority and responsibility into distinct branches and roles. This concept involves assigning distinct and limited roles to the legislature, Congress, the executive, the president, and the judiciary, the Supreme Court. The classical Greek philosopher Aristotle is credited with an early conception of government divided into three functions or powers. Those are deliberative, magisterial, and judicial, roughly corresponding to legislative, executive, and judicial roles. However, ancient philosophers didn't conceptualize separating these functions among different officials or institutions. The English Enlightenment philosopher and Thomas Jefferson's favorite person to plagiarize, John Locke, then clarified the idea of the separation of powers, formulating a theory that divided power into the more recognizable legislative, executive, and federative power. He argued that state power tends to expand and become autocratic, making separation necessary to limit power and protect our liberties, the liberties of the people. To Locke, the structure of government should look roughly like this. The legislative power has the right to direct how the community's force is used for societal preservation. The executive power is necessary for the perpetual existence of laws. Locke also described a federative power related to war, peace, leagues, and transactions with those outside the Commonwealth or the country. Think of this as international diplomacy. For the second pillar, the separation of powers exists to prevent tyranny. It's rooted in the belief that the accumulation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers is the very definition of tyranny. The French philosopher Montesquieu created the fully formed and refined concept of the separation of powers as understood by the framers of the US Constitution. He identified the three powers as we know them and argued for placing them in different people or entities to ensure liberty and prevent tyrannical actions. The third pillar notes that intrinsically tied with the separation of powers is the concept of checks and balances. Note that the Constitution of the United States doesn't completely insulate the branches from each other. Instead, the Constitution works to prevent power centralization through the codified diffusion of overlapping powers. Montesquieu also provided the basis for the concept of checks and balances, suggesting that the executive and legislative power should restrain each other. James Madison argued that the great security against gradual concentration of power is giving those in each branch the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to restrain encroachment by the others. This involves designing the government's internal structure so its parts keep each other in their proper places. He writes in Federalist No. 51 that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Examples of overlapping powers include the president's power to veto legislation, the Senate's requirement to approve nominations from the executive branch, the judiciary's power to review legislative actions, and Congress's power to remove officials through impeachment. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail later. A colleague of mine often describes the US Constitution as the Jerry Springer of constitutions because of its implementation of checks and balances. The Constitution wants the branches to fight. This all comes from a conception of human nature that these philosophers, and certainly James Madison, shared, that men aren't angels and left unrestrained, they'll tend to abuse power given to them. The fourth and final pillar notes that the separation of powers and the concept of federalism are closely linked. Both federalism and the separation of power imply the constitutional limits on state power, either through functional division, for example, the separation of powers, or through territorial division, for example, federalism. The relationship is so close that federalism and the separation of powers are basically mutually constitutive. They influence each other's existence in a reciprocal way. Montesquieu's work is also interpreted as suggesting that moderate government may require both horizontal separation of powers at the national level and a further vertical division of power, such as federalism, through regional or subnational institutions.
With no more kings.
We're going to elect a president.
No more kings.
He's gonna do what the people want.
No more kings.
We're going to run things our way.
No more kings.
Nobody's gonna tell us what to do.
As I noted before, the concept of the separation of powers can be traced back thousands of years to ancient philosophers like Aristotle, who conceived of government divided into functions like a deliberative one, a magisterial one, and a judicial authority. In those times, however, it was common for these roles to be consolidated into a singular office or person. Later philosophers tied this to mixed government, balancing different societal interests. The modern conception developed among Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who argued for the necessity of dividing legislative and executive powers to secure liberty and prevent tyranny. Montesquieu further refined this, identifying legislative, executive, and judicial powers, and arguing that they should be in different hands to prevent tyranny. The framers of the Constitution were heavily influenced by Locke and Montesquieu. All of that's review, we know this. So let's get on to the meat and potatoes of the American development of the separation of powers. Like any good Americanist, we're going to skip over all the Europeans and just dive right in. Separation of powers, or its forerunners like mixed government, existed in British North America long before the US Constitution came on the scene in 1789. The English crown had incentives to create institutions that would restrain colonial governors, who might otherwise extract excessive rents from settlers. This led to empowering settler assemblies, often through control of finances, aka the power of the purse, fostering institutional independence in turn. This experience shaped the framers' views. For example, early state constitutions after our independence from Great Britain showed varied approaches, with some reflecting an anti-executive sentiment from the Revolutionary period, by instead emphasizing legislative power. Others adopted structures more in line with the future federal model, with geographical checks and balances put in place. To illustrate this, I want you to think of a strong county or local government made to counteract potential overreach from, for example, a overreaching state assembly. A key goal of the framers was to establish a governing system that diffused and divided power to prevent its consolidation in any single person or entity. After their recent breakup with George III, they weren't big fans of kings. They viewed the accumulation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers as liable to create tyranny. They prevented this by assigning distinct and limited roles to the legislative, executive, and judicial branches in the Constitution, requiring them to be comprised of different political actors with separate bases of authority. This structure, however, didn't insulate the branches, but rather created separate institutions sharing each other's power through a system of checks and balances. For example, the presidential veto, Senate confirmation, judicial consideration of laws, and impeachment. This design, once again, was intended to invite conflict between the branches, particularly between the Congress and the President, as a means of preventing any single faction from dominating all the others. The original theory often relied on the idea that government officials would be motivated to protect their branch's prerogatives, though modern political science questions how accurately this reflects current dynamics. Specifically, early historiographical interpretations of the founding began to shape our current understanding and application of the separation of powers, especially in areas where the constitutional text was vague. Essentially, we applied a layer of historical gloss to the often messy, unclear, and undefined boundaries between interbranch authorities. So what does the separation of powers look like specifically on paper? That means in the Constitution. The Constitution implements the separation of powers by vesting distinct governmental powers in 3 separate branches. This division is explicitly laid out in the opening sections of Articles 1, 2, and 3. Beyond this initial separation, the Constitution creates a system of checks and balances, allowing each branch to limit or restrain the powers of the others. This then prevents the concentration of power. Article 1, Section 1 states that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. This establishes Congress as the sole holder of the national government's legislative authority. Article 1 also enumerates many specific powers granted to Congress in Section 8. These include the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to regulate commerce, to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, and crucially, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other power vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. This last one essentially gives the legislature the power to legislate. Congress itself is divided into 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, instituting internal checks and balances through bicameralism. Bills generally have to pass both houses to become law. The House is given the exclusive power to originate bills for raising revenue, and the sole power of impeachment. That means that only the House can draw up or initiate articles of impeachment. The Senate then is given the sole power to try all impeachments. They are, in common terms, the court in which impeachments are tried. Senators have different terms, 6 years, compared to representatives, 2 years, and senators originally were chosen by state legislatures. Now they're chosen by the people directly per the 17th Amendment. The Senate also has unique powers related to the executive and judicial branches, acting as a check relative to the House. Moving on to the President. Article 2, Section 1 declares that the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. This places the national executive authority in a single individual. Article 2 outlines the President's powers and duties. The President is made Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. The President has the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. The pardon power. The President also has the power, by and with advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of senators agree with that treaty, and to nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. You know when the news talks about a long, tense confirmation battle in the Senate for a Supreme Court justice or an agency head? That's what the Constitution is speaking to in that last section.
Sometimes I had too many beers. I liked beer. I still like beer. Had beers, have some beers. One beer, drink beer, drinks beer, drank beer, and drinking beer. You've probably had beers, Senator.
Each week, Ralph Club, biggest contributor.
You know, I got a weak stomach, whether it's with beer. I like
You
beer.
haven't answered that.
I like beer. I don't know if you do.
Okay.
Do you like beer, Senator, or not? What do you like to drink?
Next one.
The President is required to, from time to time, give to the Congress information of the state of the Union, and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. That's a requirement that the President give the State of the Union address. Finally, a fundamental duty is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Article 3, Section 1 states that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from from time to time ordain and establish. This vests the national judicial authority in a Supreme Court and other federal courts created by Congress. Article 3, Section 2 then defines the scope of the judicial power, extending it to various categories of cases in law and equity, including those arising under the Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made, or which shall be made under their authority. The Supreme Court is granted original jurisdiction. That's the ability to hear a case initially rather than through the appeals process in certain cases. For example, those affecting ambassadors in cases where a state is a party. And the Supreme Court is given appellate jurisdiction, both as law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. Basically, the Supreme Court is the final appellate court in most cases for which they don't have original jurisdiction. Judges hold their offices during good behavior, providing them with a degree of independence from other branches. They don't need to be elected or, more importantly, face re-election and constituents. The Constitution integrates checks and balances throughout these articles as well. For example, and to reiterate, Congress can impeach and remove the president. The Senate must approve treaties and many presidential appointments. Congress can override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses. Congress controls the funding for executive operations through appropriations. When you hear the phrase the power of the purse, that's what they mean. Congress can declare war, although the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Congress can establish and structure inferior courts. Congress can regulate the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction as well. Congress can impeach and remove judges just like they can the president, and the Senate must approve judicial appointments. The president then can also convene Congress on extraordinary occasions, tell them to come back to work when they otherwise wouldn't. The president can also veto legislation passed by Congress. The presidential veto is a formal tool used strategically to constrain congressional action. It requires a supermajority override, which is particularly difficult in polarized political environments like we have now. The veto is significant in legislative bargaining, allowing the president to influence policy outcomes or force concessions. The existence of the executive veto limits the legislature's ability to restrict agency discretion. For more information on the veto and power in Congress, see my video on power in Congress. While not explicitly detailed as judicial review in these articles, don't worry, we'll get into judicial review in a later video, the grant of judicial power extending to cases arising under the Constitution and laws, coupled with the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, stating the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and judges are bound by it, provides the basis for courts to interpret the constitutionality of actions taken by other branches and laws passed by Congress. In summary, the Constitution doesn't just separate powers, but intricately interweaves them through a system of checks and balances, assigning specific powers to each branch while simultaneously giving other branches the means to limit or influence the exercise of those powers. Over time, particularly since the start of the 20th century and significantly after World War II, there's been a substantial growth in presidential power. The complexities of modern society and the need for a more responsive and interventionist government led to the creation and expansion of the administrative agencies we know today. These agencies effectively short-circuited the original tripartite constitutional structure by combining legislative, executive, and sometimes judicial functions together. This development greatly broadened the power of the executive branch, as these agencies are largely answerable to the president through appointment and removal powers. The early 20th century also saw a shift in the budgetary process from a largely legislative function to one with significant executive control, notably institutionalized by the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. In response to the concern that the rise of powerful administrative agencies concentrated too much state power A sub-constitutional system of checks and balances developed within the administrative state. This system, sometimes described in the literature as triangulating administrative power, involves politically appointed agency leaders, an independent civil service supported by reforms granting job security and professional norms, and civil society, empowered through mechanisms like public notice and comment periods, before administrative rule changes, and the ability to challenge agency actions in court. You could argue that this development is an act of constitutional restoration, adapting the framers' commitment to rivalrous counterweights to the administrative context. The judiciary has implicitly recognized this, sometimes allowing state power to flow to administrative actors on the condition that these actors are subject to meaningful checks and balances. Judicial decisions regarding the removal power and the structure of independent agencies, for example, see the cases listed below, reflect a judicial acceptance of the evolving administrative state and its features. The system continues to evolve, marked by constant conflict. Divided party government has become more frequent in the post-war era, contributing to legislative-executive conflict and incentivizing Congress to fragment statutory authority and policy implementation among a larger number of distinct actors and agencies, as a means to control the bureaucracy and limit presidential influence. More recently, the rise of privatization, that is, the commingling and consolidation of state and commercial power, can be seen as a significant contemporary challenge to the administrative separation of powers. This involves agency leaders using practices like government services contracting and marketization of the bureaucracy to make administrative rivals like civil servants and civil society less effective. This practice potentially concentrates power and expands state reach by bypassing traditional constraints. This raises questions about the need for a new tertiary system of checks and balances where we implement a separation of powers between public and private entities as well. Also, in the modern day, the judiciary remains a part of this system of checks and balances, with its decision-making influenced by the actions of other branches and, importantly, by public opinion. This last point is really important to note. While the most informal of informal checks, public opinion can act as a check on power as well.
The American people believe Congress is broken. The American people believe the Senate is broken. And I believe the American people are right.
They believe that one set of rules should apply to them and another set to everybody else.
From the beginning, there were some challenges to the original model and Madisonian theory of the separation of powers. As I noted, the Madisonian conception, which assumed that the government's constituent parts would keep each other in check through ambition counteracting ambition, might be considered naive, and to not accurately reflect the dynamics of modern congressional executive relations. For example, there are structural impediments to congressional action, such as the need for bicameral agreement and the presidential veto power, which makes it difficult for Congress to override unilateral presidential actions or constrain executive power. There are political asymmetries between Congress and the presidency. Members of Congress are often not systematically motivated to protect institutional prerogatives against presidential encroachment like Madison would have liked, particularly when their party holds the presidency. More on this in a moment. The executive branch, with its unitary nature and institutional support like the Office of Legal Counsel, is often better positioned and motivated to protect its powers. Not to mention, the president is one person and Congress is a group of people that often feels like wrangling cats. Strong party affiliation can lead individual members of Congress to identify more strongly with their political party than with the legislative branch as an institution. This means that the Madisonian model of interbranch rivalry is especially inaccurate during times of unified government, as legislators are less motivated to check a president of the same party. We see that today.
The president has said clearly, and he has now ordered his DOJ to do what it is we've all needed DOJ to do for years now, and that is to get everything released. So they're in the process of that. There's no purpose for Congress to push an administration to do something that they're already doing.
Deep polarization can make enacting policy through normal legislative processes extremely difficult, and may even mitigate the electoral costs for incumbents who engage in activities that decay democracy, such as undermining the judiciary, or undermining their own authority. Recent decades have seen enhanced polarization and politicization that undermine the system's capacity to actually govern. Divided party government in recent decades has been associated with Congress choosing to fragment statutory frameworks or policy implementation as a strategy to constrain presidential power. While intended to limit presidential influence, in line with our lofty ideas of the separation of powers, this fragmentation creates its own challenges of coordination and complexity. Finally, for federal systems like ours, challenges can include a lack of effective separation of powers at the subnational level, or situations where national-level actions like federal interventions in state policy threaten the separation of powers within constituent units. Side note, I am not arguing in favor of nullification here. We do not stand John C. Calhoun on this channel. If you do, leave. The effectiveness of federalism as a check can be weakened if central governments can capture subnational governments through spending powers, or if social cleavages don't align within state boundaries.
Will someone shut that man up?
Never! Never!
So, to answer the question from the title of the video, the separation of powers is pretty important. It's a fundamental and essential principle in the United States, deeply ingrained in its constitutional design and critical to its political and governmental functions. It's widely recognized as a hallmark of the US federal and state constitutions. In essence, the separation of powers is fundamental, not just as a historical artifact of a bygone philosophical era, but as an active, dynamic framework that shapes how power is wielded, contested, and contained in the American political system. Though it may be messy and frustrating, though it faces challenges, and though it may be degraded as time goes on, I'd like to believe the framers had the right idea when instituting the separation of powers as a safeguard against tyranny. There's a list of references cited in the video in the description below. In the next one, we're going to dive into how power works in Congress. Until next time.